welcome back to Global Civics. This is the second of 6 programs, reality television programs. We all have to remember to use the microphone properly in order to get this recorded for television. For those of you who weren't here last week, these are all being recorded and they'll be presented on public television statewide in November and December. It's an experiment in public education, television education. Because not everyone who's here tonight was here last night, we are going to do a very brief recapitulation of where we started. And where we started is sort of setting the context of a discussion about global civics. So we start with a general topic of globalization. This graphic here is sort of an indicator of how we're approaching this whole topic as Montanans. We're sort of looking at the world through our own lens, our own historical and geographical experience. We're going to look at these principles of sovereignty, subsidiarity, and legitimacy that provides a framework for analyzing what's going on in the world. And the presumption that I'm putting forth is that there is some sort of trajectory to history, and it's pointing us toward eventually the realization of human rights on a global scale. And so that's kind of what's driving this project. So the way we'll go tonight is I'll just briefly go through what we went through last week. Then I'll launch a program about sovereignty. Then we'll take a break. And then our distinguished discussants, panelists, will come up and join us and have a conversation here at the table. And that will also then include any kind of commentary, public comment, questions, criticism, whatever, from members of the audience. So we want this to be as participatory as possible. So with that, I'm just going to launch into a quick recap of globalization. I'm kind of focus on the economic dimension of globalization. It has had dramatic consequences. We're familiar with a lot of them. There's kind of the old way of looking at the world economy. We regarded the rich world and the poor world as the North and the South. That's no longer common parlance. Now there's all kinds of talk about emerging markets, countries that are expanding very rapidly that used to be part of the South. We don't call them less developed countries anymore because they're emerging so fast. You see examples over there on the lower right. The world was sort of informally organized into groups. One was the Group of 8. Those were mainly advanced industrial countries, including the United States, Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Canada, Japan, and Russia. Russia was the 8th in the group. Now that's sort of passé. The group that's guiding policy around the world, again in informal terms, is a group of 20 countries. So it's those first 8 plus Argentina, Australia, Brazil, India, Indonesia, South Korea, Mexico, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, and Turkey. We used to be worried a lot about OPEC and its influence on world oil markets and the price of oil here at home. OPEC barely gets a mention anymore, especially with the advent or the resurgence of oil and gas production in North America. We're on our road to be independent of reliance on Middle Eastern oil. All my adult life, I've heard about we're running out of resources, we're running out of oil. There's a theory of peak oil that seems to have come and gone. I mean, it's still there in the shadows, but now we have a world of pervasive oil. There's oil being produced all over the world in places where no one expected it to be found or economically recovered. Been tremendous effect of liberalized trade and investment. Liberalization means fewer barriers to trade, fewer tariffs and non-tariff barriers, fewer regulations to obstruct market transactions. That has resulted in an incredible increase in worldwide prosperity. Hundreds of millions of people around the world have come out of poverty in the last 25 years. At the same time, the rich countries, with ourselves right there at the forefront, have suffered some effects of globalization. A lot of jobs have gone offshore. You all know this. A lot of supplies have been outsourced. there's supply chains. And in the wake of the financial crisis, the policy response from our government and European governments especially has been more austerity, cut the budget. So there's a big squeeze on, even though the world has prospered. So inequality within countries, backing up, the inequality among countries of the world has decreased dramatically, emerging markets. But inequality within countries has increased dramatically. And we've all followed this in the news. This Frenchman in the right-hand corner, Piketty, he's quite the celebrity economist right now. He wrote a book called Capital, and he's documented with historical data how in the form of capitalism we have in the world, there's an inexorable consolidation and concentration of wealth at the very, very top. 85 families own more than half of the value assets in the world. I mean, it's stunning how rich the rich are and how the rest of the world is struggling. And there's a basic formula he's come up with that is the return on financial assets and ownership, capital that's owned. That rate of return is higher than overall growth. And so we're stuck in this situation, according to his argument. Part of that is because money moves quickly, unregulated, all across the planet. It goes where investment possibilities exist, and there are very few restrictions. However, people are not free to move like money can move. It's hard to move across borders, as we know through immigration issues and stuff like that. The increased interdependence in the world economy definitely makes us all more vulnerable to shocks, particularly in the financial system. And we witnessed that in 2008 with the meltdown of the world economy, the financial part of the world economy. And that seems to be a major problem. That's the major weakness in globalization as a philosophy, as an ideology, is that without some kind of constriction on financial flows, there's no way to control and attain a stable world economy. The fellow in the left-hand corner, these are both really smart guys and kind of stars of the world of economists right now, came up with, he used to be a mainstream economist, and mainstream economists and Wall Street and banks have been arguing the way to grow the world economy is to take all the rules away, let everything flow. They don't talk about labor, it's all about money. And he has changed, he's had a revelation, and he's come up with something called the globalization paradox. In the wake of the financial debacle of 2008 and afterwards, the worldwide recession, he looked at which countries had suffered the least. And those countries that suffered the least happened to be countries like South Korea and Brazil and Finland, all the Scandinavian countries. They happen to have very highly regulated capital markets and not restrictive trade barriers, but moderate and not insignificant trade barriers. So the paradox is, in the world economy, you're better off with big government. As long as it's efficient and moderate, those countries have done much better. The vexing trilemma is that you can't have, in his view, globalization, democracy, and national self-determination all at the same time. So his argument is basically against hyper-globalization, and that's going against the grain of mainstream economists. Well, the vexing trilemma leads us to an even deeper conundrum, and that is about economic growth. It's an imperative worldwide. Without sustained economic growth in China, most people think the country will fall apart. It will implode. There'll be all kinds of social upheaval. So there's a strong argument for helping China sustain its economic growth. Send them coal. Send them oil and gas. Don't get in their way. In the United States, there's a strong push for new multilateral trade agreements with the Pacific countries and the Atlantic countries. China's accepted. And that whole notion is we have to stimulate economic demand in a stagnant economy in order to pick up growth, to make create new jobs, sustain growth. We have to have confidence in markets, and particularly the US dollar. That's vital to the lender countries and the borrowing countries. And we borrow immense amounts of money to sustain our deficits from China. So the interdependence that we're experiencing is remarkable, and it's all built on the idea that we have to grow or things are going to go badly. Meanwhile, with all kinds of evidence about the ecological consequences of high economic growth, we're overspending our resources. This graph on the right simply demonstrates that as we're going now, we're already spending 1.5 Earths worth of the Earth's resources. If we continued on a high growth trajectory, we'd be, 3 planets in deficit. So this is just one example of a number of ways in which economists, statisticians, politicians are trying to look at the world differently and measure our well-being differently, not just with gross measures of goods and services produced. And one of those things is the happiness index, which I invite you to look up. It's available. A lot of countries are looking into this. We have to look at the qualitative aspects of our material life, not just more of the same. Right now, technology is our friend. It buys time. It buys time for everybody. And the best example of this is in the energy field. And energy is the best barometer for measuring what is happening in the global economy and in the global political system as well. Oil and gas have been central to world affairs for our entire lives. And we're here in Montana, because we're looking at this from a Montana perspective, we're smack dab in the middle of this trick that everyone wants to play and win at. That is, fracking has unleashed an enormous amount of oil and gas in North America. That, combined with the tar sands of Alberta, which are on par with Saudi Arabia in terms of reserves of oil, and the pipeline that may or may not get permitted and may or may not get built, but it's coming our way if it does, plus the demand for the export of enormous amounts of coal from this part of North America to Asia, we're in the mix of all that. And the best case one could make, I think, I'm just positing this, for continuation of the use of fossil fuels to fuel economic growth without destroying the planet is that at some point, somebody in some lab is going to figure out how to put petroleum products into a 3-dimensional printer and extrude automobiles that run on electricity. So I'm just speaking to the technological consciousness that a lot of people in the advanced industrial countries have, that we can square this circle. We can still grow and not destroy ourselves by doing so. And it all hinges on technology. All the while, business is going on, business is booming, everyone's trying to grow the economy again, but nevertheless, great power rivalries still persist. We haven't enjoyed the peace dividend that we were supposed to get after the Cold War was over. The theory was, Soviet Union goes away, United States is a world hegemon, but a friendly one, a good one. History's basically over. Advanced capitalist democracy has won. There was a theory that's gone around, and now it's a little bit panned, called the McDonald's theory of peace. That is, if you have countries that have McDonald's franchises, they will never go to war with each other. Not because there's hamburgers, it's because McDonald's franchises connotes this incredible interdependence of business and finance and jobs, and who would attack another country that has pretty much the same material culture, same values. So that held up fairly well as a theory until the United States bombed Serbia over the Kosovo incident. Serbia had McDonald's, we bombed them for 78 days. It got worse when Russia took over, well, they didn't take over, they annexed Crimea and waged a stealth war that's still going on with Ukraine. Both have McDonald's. So the theory doesn't work very well anymore. Again, we're here in 2014, and we have to be mindful that in 1914, at the beginning of the First World War, the world's economic interdependence was at an all-time high. You didn't need a passport to go from country to country in Europe before 1914. Families were intermarried in ruling countries, these dynasties. No one imagined there could be such a conflagration as World War I before it happened. And then it happened on a fluke assassination of an archduke of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in Sarajevo. It's just a thing to remember that seemingly small, insignificant incidents can set all kinds of things in motion. And economic interdependence doesn't seem to be a major break on that kind of tragedy. With the advent of nuclear weapons, and we know who has them, and we think we know who has them, most of the competition among the great powers is in the field of economics. So there's a huge competition for resources around the world. China is buying enormous tracts of farmland and minerals in Africa. Saudi Arabia is buying huge tracts of farmland in Africa to grow food. So that's where the competition is. And it's likely to continue. We mentioned last time in our closing in the quiz where some of the strategic choke points for oil and other resources are. They still matter. They are certain straits in the oceans. And, I guess I will finish with this. In a world awash in oil, the likely cause or prize for war now is fresh water. And such a war is probably going to occur first in cyberspace or in inner orbit. So global competition among the major powers is still going on. Satellites are vulnerable, the internet is vulnerable, and water is the most precious resource after oil. So that's what we have to sort of learn to expect to come. So with that, that's kind of catching us up with where we left off last time, and we'll launch into a different topic, that is sovereignty. So give me just a second here. If I can find it. Off we go. States with a capital S mean the same thing as nation states, nations, and countries. These are interchangeable terms in common parlance. This is problematic when you start digging into sovereignty. There is no recognized higher authority than the government of a sovereign state. Countries enter into treaties, alliances, and trade agreements and organizations such as the International Criminal Court voluntarily, not because they are compelled by law. Nations have interesting stories to tell, full of passion, tragedy, and regret. States have interests and engender nationalism. Culture, that is within the nation, is a complex phenomenon, comprised of interwoven patterns of shared language, historical memory, family structures and relationships, cuisine, and artistic expression evidenced in literature. That's Louis XIV on the lower right, famous for the perfect expression of absolutism and divine right kingship. L'État, c'est moi. I am the state. Even dictators and authoritarian regimes pay lip service to popular sovereignty. Democratic states, through freedoms of thought, association, and participation, meld the hard edges with the soft tissue. Popular sovereignty is a relatively new reality. But before all that, there were empires, khanates, caliphates. And then came a series of wars in 17th century Europe that actually lasted about 50 years and resulted in a treaty called the Peace of Westphalia. Here's the battlefield before the peace. Relentless, violent struggles to settle questions of political and religious identity here in the heart of Europe. The Holy Roman Empire was neither holy nor Roman, but a lingering vestige of past centuries and a hangover of papal prestige in close connection with the temporal power of Protestant princes. The Peace of Westphalia was an agreement to disagree. Each state pledged to acknowledge and accept that neighboring states could have different values and religious beliefs. You all know that establishing the principle of state sovereignty did not prevent the British Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire, and the Nazi attempted empire, just to name a few, from trampling on the concept. But nevertheless, this is the genesis of the idea that states are sovereign, and whatever happens within them is that government's own business and nobody else's. The United Nations General Assembly manifests the principle of sovereign equality vis-a-vis international law. Every member has a seat and a voice, while the Security Council demonstrates a sort of power-based pragmatism and the super-sovereign prerogatives of the victors in World War II. The veto power of the permanent 5 members is an increasingly unmanageable anachronism. There are serious moves afoot to reform the institution so that it more clearly represents power balances in the world. For example, Germany, Japan, India, Brazil, and other countries want a permanent seat on the Council. Still, non-intervention is the prime directive. What we do inside our borders is supposedly nobody else's business. It's organized hypocrisy. States profess one thing and do another when it suits their interest. The proliferation of independent states would lead to endless conflict unless, perhaps, every state acceded to the principle of limited sovereignty, and economic and social transactions across the borders would be fluid. This is how Quebec, Scotland, and Catalonia have approached the prospect of statehood. Sovereignty association for the Quebecois, membership in the EU for the Scots and Catalans to reinforce economic integration whilst protecting language rights and other aspects of identity. Just last month, the Scots voted 55 to 45% to stay a part of the United Kingdom. The Catalans are planning to hold a referendum in November about separating from Spain, although the Spanish Constitution forbids such a vote. Africa has dozens of tribal nations comprised of people who speak several thousand different languages. Every state aspires to have its own military, its own money, its own airline. This is the late Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan. He wrote the book called Pandemonium, in which he made the case that nationalism has not gone away, it's increased. We're going to be dealing with ethnic separatism and the creation of states forever, unless some kind of new prospect is born and supported. We live in a complex world with 196 states already. Actually, it's 195 if you don't count Taiwan, and China seemingly never will. Canada is famously known as 2 nations warring within the bosom of a single state. Belgium has Dutch-speaking Flemish and Francophone Walloons. Bosnia's Muslim center, a vestige of the Ottoman Empire, is bracketed by the Serb Republic and populated still by lots of Croatians. This is not a stable situation. There are 27 member states in the EU, including a number of Eastern European countries formerly dominated by the Soviet Union. Croatia is the most recently admitted, and there are strict entry requirements. Ukraine and Serbia are keen to join. Turkey seems to have given up, even though it's a member of NATO. There are several reasons, but the main one seems to be that the EU is a reconstruction of Christendom, albeit a secular one. Europeans have difficulty accepting some 70 million Muslims into the fold. Joel Kotkin is a sociologist who reveals that shared traits have helped certain dispersed ethnic groups triumph in the arena of international business, technology, and communications. These global tribes act in concert as a vast familial network, transcending the boundaries of states, combining ethnic identity with a cosmopolitan outlook and a passion for knowledge. Smaller countries are tribal too. In some cases, over 30% of a country's GDP is supported by payments that family makers make living abroad in diaspora. This was essential to the creation of Israel. Albania is just one example of a small country that lives off the wherewithal of Albanians living in the United States, in Europe, Switzerland, elsewhere. A French Canadian once wrote that a nation is the desire of many individuals to do great things together. Journalist Joel Garreau based this book, The 9 Nations of North America, on a drawing he made on a cocktail napkin. Nations can be constructed along economic and regional lines of logic. Someone took a stab at applying the concept to China. That's in the lower right. Notice that we Montanans are situated in the so-called empty quarter of North America, with treasure troves of energy resources, but with relatively few inhabitants. Montana is also a member of the Pacific Northwest Economic Region, which exemplifies the growing reality of transnational regional associations. Limited sovereignty is my favorite oxymoron because it embodies cosmic contradictions that shape the political psychology of individuals and the political ecology of the world. As laboratories, states can exercise the legitimate option to experiment with public policies so long as they don't contravene the U.S. Constitution. Long dormant, the 10th Amendment has given rise to a movement to restore states' rights. This is not just a Tea Party thing. There have been bipartisan efforts to push back on certain features of the Patriot Act, on No Child Left Behind, and medical marijuana, among other issues. Federalism and the separation of powers are intentional limitations on the sovereign authority of the central government. The concept has spread widely, especially among large countries, and even some that retain formal ties to a monarchy. You probably know that the Queen of England is also the Queen of Canada and the Queen of Australia. So even though these are democratic countries, they're federal states, they still formally are tied to the British Crown. Before we leave the subject of limited sovereignty, a few brief things about the Montana Constitution. It is truly a lovely thing. Let me read these first two sections in Article 2, the Declaration of Rights. 1. All political power is vested in and derived from the people. All government of right originates with the people, is founded upon their will only, and is instituted solely for the good of the whole. The people have the exclusive right of governing themselves as a free, sovereign, and independent state. They may alter or abolish this Constitution and form of government whenever they deem it necessary. The state constitution has provisions, noted in the slide, that go beyond those in the U.S. Constitution, and they are much more explicit. We've got trouble. With respect to states' rights and the 10th Amendment, we're looking at sort of a renaissance of the Sagebrush Rebellion. You've probably heard that there's an official policy of the Republican Party at the moment to take back millions of acres of public land from the federal government and have it administered by the state. This is a multi-state endeavor. You're going to hear a lot about it. I can't dive very deeply into the subject of tribal sovereignty. It's dangerous as a non-lawyer and a non-specialist to get into the details. But I want to note that Montana is a leader in the conduct of state-tribal relations in the legislative and executive arenas of government, notwithstanding a panoply of complications, difficulties, cross-cultural contradictions, and failures of leadership. The relationship between the federal government and Indian tribes has not been consistent. And the ebb and flow of federal supports and intrusions has further complicated the government-to-government relations between state and tribe, as evidenced in the current struggle to reach a compact over water rights in the Flathead Reservation and beyond. This list simply tries to demonstrate the commonality of sort of philosophical basis that is shared by Aboriginal peoples in North America, Canada, and the United States alike. The column on the right is more specifically attributable to the policy of the U.S. federal government as interpreted by the Supreme Court. So we can see that the notion of tribal sovereignty is severely limited by the powers of Congress in the United States. And the Canadian Indians are not much better off with respect to tribal self-determination. Just a few things here. A lot of people regard Indian tribal nations as racial entities. Strictly speaking, in legal terms, that's not the case, although it's complicated. But it's the United States government that has determined that an Indian is an Indian because of a certain blood quantum. Beyond that, the tribes themselves determine who may or may not be enrolled. But it's not the tribes themselves who have asserted that you have to have a certain amount of blood to be an Indian. A lot of important relationships are based on treaties between the United States and tribes. Those treaties have been broken. They can be abrogated legally by the Congress. As again, there's a very inconsistent pattern. For a long time, the United States wanted to protect Indians through treaties. Then they wanted to terminate reservations altogether. President Nixon was the first modern president to advocate self-determination. Another thing to remember is that when the Indian tribes enter into treaties, they are making concessions to the United States. They are not getting rights from the United States. That's the settled law in the United States. So a lot of people have a misconception that Indian rights have been conferred upon them by the United States. No, they were there before, and there's a treaty to understand what they are and what they mean. Lastly, the state has very limited jurisdiction with respect to Indians on reservations. It's a triangular relationship. The federal government is preeminent. The tribes and states are co-equals in terms of the law. Big question about where tribal sovereignty is going in North America and in Montana particularly. One specific aspect with respect to water is that there was a huge decision made by federal courts in Montana way back in the early part of the 20th century that established that Indian tribes have the right to water as much as they need to sustain life on their reservation. And we're still living with that because as you know, we live in a prior appropriation state where everyone has first in time, first in right. Well, the Indians were here way before anyone else, and that has given rise to some controversies. We're almost done. Getting back to that big picture, the future of state sovereignty is anything but clear, but there's no reason to expect much stability in the years ahead, as evidenced by this panoply of separatist conflicts going on worldwide. One glaring example and current example of the mishmash of borders made by foreign powers is in the Middle East, where two bespectacled diplomats, one British, the other French, carved up portions of the Ottoman Empire following its dissolution at the end of World War I. Much of the bitterness and anti-Western sentiment in this region is a consequence of arbitrary yet binding decisions made by former colonial powers. There's a lot of the same thing going on in Africa and Asia too. And if you look at this map, there's a startling sort of resonance between the shape of space on this map and what's going on today with respect to ISIS and other groups rebelling against established states. The ISIS crisis in the Middle East may yet result in the birth of new states, such as Kurdistan. The approximately 40 to 50 million Kurds live in a mountainous, oil-rich region that includes parts of Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran. They have a common language, a shared history, and a relatively secular Muslim culture. They are a bona fide nation without a recognized state. We'll have at least not yet, and we'll have the opportunity to talk about Palestine and Israel in the weeks ahead. Finally, political communities and individuals are like onions. We construct our loyalties and fealties in layers, from the innermost core of identity, the sovereign soul, to the outermost membrane of morally acceptable and practically justiciable authority. For some, that inner sanctum is sacrosanct and clothed in religious belief. For others, it is a fascinating maelstrom of competing forces of nature, such as germs, viruses, memories, desires, and the sparks of conscience. Likewise, the outer layers of legitimate political authority are a matter of unceasing public argument in a free society. One thing is certain and nearly universal. It is wise to handle onions gently and not cut across their many layers indiscriminately unless one wants to shed a lot of tears. So I leave you, panelists, discussants, and everybody, with a quote about the continuing utility of national sovereignty. And if we're going to come up with something different, it has to be something good and coherent. And then the question for you to ponder out loud together is, where is the proper locus of sovereignty in the 21st century? Of course, you're not required to answer this question. You're not even required to address it at all. I'm just throwing it out there as a starter for the conversation we'll have. That will start in about 5 minutes. So we'll take a brief break, come back, and our discussants will assemble up here, and we'll continue. Thank you. Okay. Well, I want to welcome back our distinguished discussants, Jeanette Fruguglia from Carroll College, Denise Runge from Helena College, John Driscoll from around town and many occupations in recent years, Terry Kendrick from the Office of Public Instruction, and our newcomer, he wasn't able to be here last week, is Dennis Taylor, who has a distinguished career in public service here in Montana and elsewhere, as well as being a veteran. So I want to apologize in advance to all of you that I have to kind of stay tethered to the microphone here, which is awkward for you to turn around and look. So don't feel like you have to turn around and look at me. You can just talk to me with your back to me. That's be fine. It's just a problem with the infrastructure. So with all that, remember we need to share the microphones. And after you have a decent interval of time to discuss this subject among yourselves, we'll of course invite the public to weigh in when it's timely. So with that, I think just arbitrarily, I'm going to start with John. He's got a microphone near him, and you can attempt to answer the big question or say what you will about the subject of sovereignty. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. I'm of the opinion that the Montana Constitution is right on point, that the font of sovereignty is the individual. I feel very strongly about that. And over the 50 years since I first discussed sovereignty when I was an undergraduate and then through several different graduate curriculum, I've watched sovereignty change, the balance between individual and state. The balance between individual and state, local, church, marriages, all that's changed so that I've come to the conclusion that sovereignty is a moving target, but it still comes from the individual. It's kind of like watching a kaleidoscope with all the pieces moving around, the pieces of the individual. And I'm struck, for example, when Archbishop Hunthausen was protesting nuclear missiles out in Puget Sound, the final letter he got after the apostolic visitation from the keeper of the faith back in those days, Cardinal Ratzinger, made a claim that the church had a claim on the individual's conscience, and I don't agree with that, and I'm a Catholic. I feel very strongly that the fount of sovereignty comes from the individual. However, pieces of it's out there floating. And I would also say that it seems to me some of the biggest changes have come from individuals taking back their power, women taking back their power from marriages. I've seen during Vietnam, I've seen people who were close friends opt to go to Canada instead of go with the draft or go into the service like I did. And I respected them for that. I've watched Catholics disagree with our church over different things and take back their sovereignty, refuse to be Roman Catholics and instead be American Catholics. So sovereignty is really changing, and I think, for example, many feel very strongly there should be no United Nations. I disagree with that. I think it should be stronger. But then what's it going to enforce if the nation-state system is starting to change so dramatically, such that a guy like Dr. Kissinger recently said that even he felt, and he's the chessboard master of the world, even he felt that the entire nation-state system is in a deep state of flux right now. That's a big statement for him. And then I think, in answer to the question, what do I think should be the locus? It still should be the individual. However, I think an important piece of my sovereignty will go to the electricity reliability consoles. This is I know I sound like a one-note Charlie, but during that 50 years, we had a blackout in 1965 that shut down 30 million people in the Northeast for 13 hours. And from that came a voluntary system of coordinating consoles to ensure our reliability for electricity so we could have all these wonderful technologies. And then in 2003, a still worse blackout happened in almost the same area that shut down 50 million people. And when there's a blackout, you're pretty much out of luck, individual or not. And since that time, that was the 10th largest blackout in 65. That was the 7th largest blackout in history in 2003. And there was another bad one in 73 where a lot of looting took place. But the worst blackout in history took place in India, where 670 million people went without energy, without electricity, which tells you how big these emerging nations have become economically, because the total number of people that have electricity service in the North American reliability consoles is only 334 million people. So twice the number of people we have had a blackout in India. And without electricity, without that precise control of energy in a intermediate form, it's very expensive to acquire, but it gives you all these benefits. Our cell phones, for example, this microphone is another. Without that, we don't have globalization. So I'm of the strong belief that we need to have reliability consoles, and I'm willing to give up some of my sovereignty for that.
Thank you, and please don't rely on me to moderate the discussion or expect a response to everything. I find that fascinating, but that is irrelevant right now. So just be free to have a conversation among yourselves, and if you want to address a question to me, I'm more than game to get into it. But I don't want you to feel like you have to bounce things off of me. So let's continue with whomever would like the microphone next.
John, I really appreciate your comments, and before tonight's discussion, I was thinking in terms of sovereignty. When I think about it, I think about who has the power to make what decisions that will impact my life. So, we live in families. There's sort of a power structure in families in terms of who makes decisions. We live in communities. You have to have some, who makes decisions in a community. Our government, I think, has a somewhat schizophrenic view of individual sovereignty, that there are people who say the government doesn't have the right to tell you, how many guns you might be able to own, but yet does have the right to tell a woman what her reproductive rights are going to be. So that we don't have a real clear view of what individual sovereignty is, let alone sort of community and nation states. Because I come from the Office of Public Instruction, and again, I want to make a disclaimer that I am not a licensed teacher. I'm not an educator. But I feel like we really have a great opportunity here in Montana to teach young people about international sovereignty within our own borders, because we have 12 tribal nations, and they are sovereign nations, and they interact, with the state government and with the federal government. And there are, that relationship has changed a lot over the centuries, and we can we can talk about some of those things a bit later. But I think Montana is real unique in that way, and its constitution recognizes that students need to learn about the unique cultural heritage of the tribal nations.
I'm going to sort of echo what John started and what you've talked about. I feel like I'm sitting here tonight because of the 1972 Constitution. I was so smitten by that. I came to Montana that year in 1972, and my life was changed. I've stayed here for most of the time since then. And the idea that the people are sovereign is a fundamental part of the Montana Constitution. It's also what we think of when we think about democracy. It's based on popular sovereignty. But I feel like that particular sovereignty that rests with the individual has to be shared with the community, has to be shared with a larger group, so that there's some type of territory, some type of population, some type of entity that has powers, so that we're not just saying, I'm the boss of me. If you think about it from an anarchist perspective, being in Eugene as a city manager, I've met people who work around the world to espouse anarchist traditions, but they're really saying, I'm the boss of myself. While I was in Eugene, it was when they had the SARS crisis, and we had students coming to two higher ed universities, and so we were worrying about what would happen if we couldn't find some way to deal with that crisis. We look Ebola in the face right today. And if everybody's the boss of themselves, if we have absolute unfettered personal individual sovereignty, then how do we govern ourselves? How do we protect the entity? How do we protect the globe? How do we protect each other? So that's the conundrum for me. I start with what the Montana Constitution says, but I feel a need for some other bounds. And so I'm anxious to hear your take on sovereignty tonight.
Yeah, Dennis, I agree. I think that, we have philosophically one idea and then practically another idea. So philosophically, as citizens of the United States, most every person is going to first think about, the individual rights, because that's our founding ideal. The Declaration of Independence, our Constitution as a nation, most of the state constitutions, not as eloquently as Montana's, but most of them address this issue that first the right to form governments rests with the people, but it goes without saying that we agree to form governments. And so the heart to me of this underlying question of what is the correct locus is the issue that was presented in the slides, which is that cultural, is that economic, is that political, or some milieu, some mix of all of the above? As a political and economic observer, I find the most interesting tension is the one between those two boundaries. Those cultural boundaries typically have not, throughout most of history, actually defined states. And my colleague here can talk more about that. We've seen cultures or nations actually cross state boundaries many, many, many times throughout history. But it tends to be more the case that political groups and political similarities and or economic groupings and economic similarities are what define us in terms of our sovereignty, in terms of our ability to make laws to govern ourselves, to make the rules of interaction with others, and sort of where we draw those lines. And I think bringing up the tribal nations is a great example. I personally have looked into for years the issue of the casinos, and so you look at the the Bureau of Indian Affairs, you look at the requirement to negotiate with the governors of the specific state in which the tribal lands happen to be, and yet then there's this sort of everybody accepts natural sovereignty that the tribes have to do what they want to do. But it comes down, does it not, in my opinion, to economics and politics.
I'd like to offer another. I love hearing. This is such a pleasure for me to get to be here to talk to my colleagues, etc. I'd like to offer maybe a slightly different perspective. I'm reading my way through a book by a scholar from Lebanon who currently teaches at the University of London called "The People Want," and it's that very question about what is it that the people want, and he's referring specifically to, of course, the uprisings of the Arab Spring and the language of what is it that the people want, and it speaks to that very issue, I think, of sovereignty. And I think what we have to think about, though, is that if we all agree sort of as a group, and possibly people in the audience as well, that the locus of sovereignty is the individual, then at what point are we willing to accept expressions of sovereignty and self-determination that we may not like, with which we may not agree? And for me, that's a real tension, because I tend to err on the side of, we may not like it, but that's not my choice, because that's not my country, that's not my part of the world, that's not my culture, that's not my faith, my faith, whatever it is. And so I would sort of offer that up as something to think about as well, because I agree. I think that sovereignty rests with the individuals, with the collective, with the people. The people want. What is it that the people want? But then we have to think about some of these other tensions, and I think some of these other issues, and they're very important.
I'd like to respond to something you said about, sort of the anarchism where everybody is the boss of me. There is a part of me that really can appreciate. When I was in college, I had a friend, and I remember him telling me that his dad said, you walk around town like you think you own the place. And his response to his dad was, no, I walk around town like nobody owns the place. And while in some ways I really liked that sense of power, so I would like to see more people in our country feel like they do have power to participate in the decisions that affect their lives, yet also knowing that there's a way to do that, that you participate at the community level, you go to city council meetings, you go to county commission, you run for the legislature, you do those things. My concern is that we have fewer and fewer people participating. I mean, the thing that Stephen said about 85 families owning half of the world's assets is like, nobody's going to be sovereign anymore except the 85 families if we're not careful. I mean, in terms of some of the real decisions that we're able to make. So there's a part of me that really likes that sort of individual and communal pushback against, say, an unjust system, but also needing to do it within the defined, cultural laws and norms of the system.
So that, to me, that's, I like the notion of being a citizen. Mm-hmm. You do own the place, so you have rights, but you also have responsibilities. What I used to say to new employees coming into city organizations is that democracy was an important thing. Rule of law was an important thing, and it was a fragile thing. It's not been manifest very long in our country. It's an experiment we've been having for 400 years, 500 years, I don't know. But every Monday night, it's a hypothesis. Will we be able to govern ourselves, this community, with a modicum of civility? We'll be able to create a legal structure that most people will agree to, or at least agree to the rule of law and seek to change it through a process like a city council or a county commission. Or I've spent many years in the Capitol building watching our Montana legislature, a citizen legislature, and they do. Every 2 years, they cope with the notion, do we have the capacity to govern ourselves? And we don't know the answer every January. We worry. Can we do it? Every Monday night in city halls all across the country, people wonder, can we govern our community as citizens? in a democracy. It's the tough choice, but it's the struggle I'm willing to have to maintain individual sovereignty as well as having a sense of a collective. And I don't know whether that's a community, a state, a nation, or part of a global community. And increasingly, I've been exposed to more parts of the world, and I'm curious about how we could extend the notion of democracy in a structure where people could have the ability for self-determination, but not be bound by religious, territorial, national, ethnic divides that lead in so many cases over and over again to violence and destruction and the lack of a rule of law in a governed society.
I think I think that's a really interesting question for today. And I posed this question to a group of my students, and we were thinking about Hong Kong and what do the people of Hong Kong want? And I, of course, want to attribute some of it, not all of it. There are no straight lines in history. But if you think back again, to the events of 2011 and the Arab Spring, and they really started other places thinking about what is it that we want, who governs us, how do we choose to govern ourselves. I prefer self-determination because it sounds a little less West-centric, right? And some of these places don't think of democracy like we do. So self-determination is kind of the word that I prefer with my students. But I said, how can we look at what's happening in Hong Kong now, or the tension in Ukraine, and ask this very same question of sovereignty? Because I think all over the world, not just here, people are asking that very question. We're not part of China. Yes, we are, et cetera. And I think that in some ways, this question of sovereignty is particularly timely today, as we see places make a challenge for what do we want and how do we want to see ourselves governed, and whether or not the world likes it.
I just have a quick thought in response to that, and it's so funny how our disciplinary perspectives keep coming out, because I'm thinking as a political scientist, okay, so we put that up to a vote, and 50% plus one rules, which means 49.9% are displeased. So where's the sovereignty? And that, I think, comes back to the earlier statement, I think it was Dennis's, and actually several of us have said that we want to govern ourselves, and yet we also want to be part of something bigger than ourselves. And so why would 49 point whatever % be willing to go along with an outcome that's different from what they wanted? And that's maybe where we can begin to discover what this sovereignty really means, because there's something bigger than themselves and bigger than what they want that they adhere to. It's some nation, it's some state, it's some symbol, it's something, a cultural identity, a political identity, I don't know. But why do we all go along when the president gets elected that we didn't want? Why do we still pay our taxes and still follow the rules? And maybe I could throw that out to some audience members to think about as well. Why do we go along when we're displeased? What is it that drives us to do that? And that might help us understand this tension that we're describing between individual sense of self-governance and what do we want, and what about those of us who are left out of the majority, and how do we deal with them?
Yeah, I'm quickly just going to jump in and reiterate your invitation to anyone in the audience. Feel free to approach the microphone, and we'll recognize you immediately if you approach the microphone. But don't be shy. If you have a comment or a question, now's the time to start raising it and enter into the fray, so to speak. One thing that all of you have sort of provoked in me is sort of an acknowledgement that not everyone may share, but we live here in Montana in a pretty libertarian culture. The notion of individual rights and individual sovereignty is really up there for most people, regardless of party, cultural persuasion, background. We kind of like that notion of individual rights and individual self-determination. Reflecting on that, though, in my own mind, it's sort of like, well, what's the point of individual sovereignty in community, when my whole life is with other people. And, I want the government to leave me alone some of the time, maybe even most of the time, but my rights and responsibilities are meaningless outside of close and frequent association with other people who also share this sovereignty. And that, I have another notion to throw out there. It's going to be probably ill-conceived and not very articulate. But the more I look at this question, it seems to me that sovereignty is like quantum. It's like in a physics world, it's like a particle or a wave or both at the same time. It's everywhere. It's concentrated in certain parts of humanity, in certain parts of our consciousness, but it may even exist, among other species. I don't want to go too far afield, but the whole notion that animals have rights, it's because there's a sovereignty there too. So I'm kind of just throwing that out there as maybe a wild idea, that sovereignty is something kind of like in the Cat in the Hat, it's this stuff that's green and you touch it and it spreads and it's everywhere, and we just sort of have to grapple with that fact that everything has sovereignty of a sort, and the struggle is to figure out a way to balance one's own with the rights and responsibilities of one's community, one's nation, continent, and world. So that's my 2 cents worth into the fray. And please have at it if you have a question, but let's continue the roundtable. If not, a question from the audience.
Can I weigh into what you said?
Absolutely.
I think that's really, really interesting, because I think that's the challenge of our time, is to, in some way, acknowledge that sovereignty is a moving target, and it always will be, right? But I think that that's a challenge to all of us, and maybe a question to the audience as well, right?
I'm going to move around so you don't have to bend your neck that way.
Yeah, and it may be a challenge to the audience as well, is that how do we live in communities that give us some sense of, community, right? And some sense of empowerment and sovereignty, and the acknowledgement that we have to live in the rest of the world with everyone else. And I think that that's what a lot of places with which they're struggling right now. I do.
That idea of rubbing shoulders with like-minded people or similarly capable people is really powerful. I know it probably does sound irrelevant because so few people think about it, but it's very important. The Ayatollah Khomeini was able to seize power in Iran by using the cassette recorder to get his sermons around. Cory Aquino was able to take power back in the Philippines by using the video recorder, another electricity-based technology. Tiananmen Square took place because people used the fax machines in the hotels. And of course, we've all seen the Arab Spring in Hong Kong, the umbrella revolution with the cell phones. And what those all do, in my mind, is they allow people of a similar mind to talk with each other and build a community, a bigger community than a nation's boundaries, really. And so that's what's going on right now, exactly. Instead of just a town meeting and your neighborhood in the town meeting, there's something much bigger going on.
The thing I would say about sovereignty, too, is that it's usually a reciprocal relationship. It is that you're sovereign because it's you or your entity, but it's also recognized by others as being that you are, in fact, sovereign. Talks about we tolerate Crimea and maybe an incursion into Ukraine based on power relationships because the cost of asserting, that's not really what, you're not sovereign in that area because it's an illegitimate incursion into another sovereign country, Ukraine. But we don't really want to incur the costs. So a lot of the power relationships, whether it's the dividing up the world in 1914 or 1919 or in Yalta or whatever, we do this over and over again, and we extend sovereignty. We create entities. We agree to acknowledge them. We create structures like the UN and the Security Council, but it's really because we agree to that or acquiesce to it. It's more than just I assert that I am the sovereign, but other people agree for now you are a sovereign entity in some way. If I'm making any sense in that regard.
And sovereignty also changes depending on who asks and answers the question, what do we want? So, for example, in 1862, the Homestead Act and the Railway Act came into being. That changed the former treaties that this country had with Indian tribes. So what ended up happening was certainly not was not what the Indians wanted as sovereign people. And yet people who I want to go out west and stake my, claim and have a farm in North Dakota and Montana, that's what they wanted. So, who has the ultimate power, and that decision changed sovereignty for one group over another.
And that's making me go back and think again about these 85 families or whatever, that there's this very small group that probably now as much, if not more than ever, has exercised control over all the rest of us with or without our consent in many, many ways. And so do we have the level of sovereignty that we believe we have? It's a little bit terrifying, frankly, to think of when you realize, the power that represents. And then you balance that against the power that's represented by Yik Yak and Twitter and Facebook. But being on college and university campuses, there's a lot of talk right now about this Yik Yak phenomenon, which is just the latest version of whether it was, a cassette recorder or a fax machine or a cell phone. Now it's these social networks that anybody, anywhere, anytime, can not only start a movement, but carry it to extraordinary lengths in a moment. And so I think maybe a lot of this is our attempt to gain back power, because we inherently feel that power is concentrating elsewhere, and we don't want it to. And so how can we take it back if we don't have those resources? What do we have? Well, we have our voice. It's an interesting idea.
I think also we tend to, and probably my colleague, the political scientist, can speak to this better than I can, but I think we tend to conflate sovereignty with boundaries. Right? Is that, yes, okay. And so that in many places around the world, the sovereign boundaries of the Middle East or Africa were imposed on the people that were there, and they're not the boundaries they would have chosen. And I've told this story to my students. I know the leader of a Bedouin tribe in the Judean wilderness outside of Jerusalem, and he laments the loss of his sovereignty to travel between Israel, Palestine, and Jordan. And he feels that a boundary was imposed on him, and that was a direct sort of, in essence, assault on the sovereignty of his tribe and of his people. And it's I thought it was very compelling for me to rethink this idea of sovereignty and the fact that we want to conflate it with the drawing of boundaries. But those boundaries could change. I mean, that is precisely what ISIS, that's precisely what they want to do, is redraw those boundaries. And we've done it to people in our own country as well, right? And so I think we have to grapple with the fact that boundaries right now mean nation states and mean sovereignty, but it doesn't always have to, and people are always trying to change those.
I'm glad we're sort of expanding this. Just by serendipity, I got involved with an effort to bring books to Burma, to Myanmar. They had a Nargis cyclone, and it just destroyed the whole water delta. And so a bunch of people decided, well, we'll bring books to there because of their Buddhist traditions. They have a literate society. And so we were arranging for 1 million books to be delivered in Burma. And then I was part of a team that went to verify at libraries all over Myanmar that actually occurred. So I was in Mandalay, and I was in Yangon, and I was all through the Delta. And and it was also right after Aung San Suu Kyi was released. And there was some beginning recognition of the country, and there was a loosening of this really repressive military dictatorship since the 60s, a really, hopeful time for the country. And they were making peace from the endless war that they'd had with the Shan and the Kurens and the Karns, and they've been involved with an imposed geography, Burma, because of a British relationship. And these other groups didn't feel like they were part of Burma, and they didn't feel like they wanted to be their own state. So they're struggling with this. But as this time when I'm hopeful, once they seemed to be coming to a place that I was very hopeful, the first thing they did was go kill all their neighbors who were Muslims. They denied every Muslim in that country any rights to any form of citizen, any right to participate, even though they may have lived in the country for 3 or 4 generations. So it's a problem for me because I look at these countries that begin to exhibit hope, and then when they have some freedom, they divide on tribe, on race, on nation state, and then they kill their neighbors. And I mean, places where my daughter was in Kyrgyzstan, she had good friends in Osh and good friends in Bishkek. And as things changed, people who had been neighbors for 70 years, Kyrgyz people killed their ethnic Uzbek neighbors. So that's where I sort of draw the line. That's not a sovereignty that I want to encourage, and I'm perplexed why it so frequently happens in the history of the world that people divide up into their tribe who they think they're sovereign, and then deny other people their sovereign right to just live in their state, in their community, in their nation. I don't know the answer, but it is perplexing to me, and I see it with increasing frequency, is that once people have a chance, they impose their will, their sovereignty, and take other people, less powerful people, different people's sovereignty away.
And that's the very question that's going on between Israel and Palestine.
Well, with that, Dennis, we have time for a brief response to that. We need to leave about 7 minutes for a required quiz event, and we do need to finish tonight on time. So you're welcome to have kind of a final word, if you will.
Well, okay.
We have a couple minutes.
Thank you. I've been working all day trying to sort out what happened in Gaza when the Israelis, during their most recent incursion, destroyed their only power plant, electric power plant. Well, I was curious whether that's a war crime or not. Their sewage isn't getting cleaned, the hospital's in terrible shape, and so forth. But as it turns out, 70% of the electricity into Gaza comes partly from Israel and partly from Egypt. And then that power plant only provided 30%, but they were already down to 20 hours a week with the power plant. So they've got a very serious problem. When I looked at it, the distance between Tel Aviv and Cairo is as close as Billings to Helena. And Cairo has been having these blackouts. And one of the big reasons given for Morsi falling was that the people who put him into power were very unhappy at the quality of their life because he couldn't keep their power plants going. Meanwhile, over in it, and so now they got a new government over there, which the Israelis favor, or at least are more supportive of. And meanwhile, over in Israel, they've had major blackouts in the last year. And it's gotten so bad that now Mr. Netanyahu has decided to privatize the wholly owned government Israeli Electricity Corporation. I looked at it, and I'm thinking the best place for them to link those two control areas, Israel and Egypt, which both badly need to have better reliability because of a quality of life issue, is to put a new power plant into Gaza that will run off natural gas and be wired into both control areas. But it seems as though this phenomena that Dennis has talked about, it inhibits people's ability to think objectively about their situation. And they do really maliciously stupid things. And it mystifies me.
Well, with that, we will end the conversation formally. It's going to continue in the weeks ahead. I think we're just getting started. I thank you so much for your participation. I still welcome participation. We all do from other people. So maybe next time we'll get some audience involved. But the last stage of the evening is bear with me here for just a second. we have to keep trying to get better at our geography as a world power with all kinds of rights and responsibilities to respect here and abroad. So I'm going to bring this up, if I can. I'm going to make this quiz easy on people. It might be difficult to get the right answer, but it's easy to take the quiz and feel good about learning something in case you didn't know. So here we are, 4 questions. And just think about it for a second. You can make a note if you feel like it. But, you know, we're talking about the world of 195 nation states, legally nation states. What's the oldest? What's the biggest? What's the smallest? And what are the 2 newest ones? So we'll give you a minute to ponder that. Oh, excuse me. You might want to imagine the Jeopardy theme song going on, something like that. So we need a musical theme.
I'm hoping that next week's quiz is going to be on pop culture. I'm not doing this.
No, okay, let's move on.
I heard this quote the other day where God created wars so that Americans could learn geography.
Okay, who wants to volunteer an answer to the first one? Just take a stab at it.
I'd say it's the Vatican.
The oldest? Yeah. All right.
The oldest diplomatic corps.
All right. We're going to see the answers here in a minute, all together. How about the biggest country? Russia. Most people know that. How about the second biggest? Canada. Whoever said Canada gets a star for that one. All right, the smallest sovereign state on the planet. Oh, if people know their Vatican. I know that's correct. I'm just giving you advance warning. You got that one right.
Yeah, okay.
What are the 2 newest countries? Correct. 2011, South Sudan became a country by breaking apart from the larger Sudan. Oh, yes. We've got a geography scholar in the back. So here you go. You're right. Actually, the claim to being the oldest is contested. Japan says it got started in 660 BC. China in 221 BCE, I guess. And they both make claims that they are the oldest state. Exactly. It hasn't been continuous. So that's why the argument exists. Like, yeah, they got started a long, long time ago, but they went away and came back, went away and came back. Now, San Marino claims to be, and most people support this, the oldest continuous republic on the face of the planet, born in 301 AD. Does anybody know where that is? Yeah, it's a teeny tiny country surrounded completely by Italy. So it's about midway down Italy, not far from Rimini and the Adriatic coast. Russia is still the biggest in terms of land mass. China would be the largest in terms of population. Vatican City, you were right about that, smallest country in the world, 0.2 square miles, 120 times smaller than the island of Manhattan. And you were right in the back about South Sudan and Kosovo. Kosovo, by the way, is also not only one of the youngest states in the world, it has the youngest population. Like over half of the population in Kosovo is under the age of 18. So a lot of energy and youthful exuberance, enmeshed in the Balkans. Well, that brings us to a close. I want to invite you back next week where, we're going to talk about a subject that's very closely related in this triad of analysis to sovereignty, and that's legitimacy. A number of you sort of addressed that in ways already. We're just going to continue and look more in a more focused way on questions of legitimacy. So with that, I want to thank you again for your participating, for coming tonight. Look forward to next week, and we'll call it a wrap.